That's okay.
Hey, Delson, how's it going? I'm Levi. Nice to meet you.
Good.
Um,
You as well. Good to be here.
Thank you for coming on my podcast. I was pretty keen to speak with you. I'm a bit of a fan. I haven't read all your books, but I've read a couple of them, and I got pretty involved into the TWIM sort of methodology a while back, and I felt like you're a pretty good teacher and quite eloquent the way you spoke about these things. I was there's a couple of things I wanted to speak to you about because I just feel like you're very well placed to maybe answer some of my questions or even just less answering questions and more. I had this idea that I kind of wanted to basically info dump a little bit of my experience about my journey so far to you, and then I guess just kind of gather how you feel about it because I wouldn't say I'm conflicted about just like my path and all the Dharma stuff, but I've got some things where it's really changed the way I view a lot of this. So yeah, if you don't mind, I was just gonna not shut up for a minute and
Mhm.
then just kind of like go through it. So yeah, I've been really into meditation for a really long time. I'm 31 and since I was like 18, I got into it. More so then as just like I heard it was like, self development, here's a productivity tip to try to make your brain work better. And I was always very like ADHD, so I was like, oh yeah, sweet, it'll help with my focus. And then doing it for like 6 or 7 years after that, eventually I had this very eye-opening experience where it was like at the end of this kind of like party hippie thing out in the bush, which bush is a Australian term, which means like countryside. And I was at this thing for like a couple of days, and at the very end of it, I had this like pretty scary experience where it felt like I was kind of like my heart was like giving out. And at that point, I had some sort of like health complications with my cholesterol and stuff, which I wasn't really medicating. But at the very end of it, I had this like what felt like a near-death experience, and then it just opened up into it's pretty hard to explain, but it's like this equanimous sort of feeling of, in some ways it feels kind of trite, in some ways it was very expansive because the triteness about it was it felt like the whole time before I was living with this like sense of self that was sort of governing everything I do. And then at this point it was just like that was gone. I still had thoughts, but they were no longer this sort of authorship that I was reactively like living against. And it was amazing. The most amazing part of it was that it lasted for about 4 weeks without like any sense of self creeping in or any sort of like negative feelings or up feelings. It was just pure bliss state 24/7 with no like waking up and like, oh, I'm hungry, I should check this. It was just like I was no longer a passenger. I was just there. And yeah, so anyway, it was a very amazing experience. And at that point I rightly or wrongly was like, oh, this seems to be kind of maybe what the Buddha was talking about. And at that point, I was even more inexperienced than I am now. And so I wasn't really sure about all of it. I was a pretty big fan of some teachings and I was like a big into Alan Watts guy when I was young. I don't know if you've heard of that person. And I read a bunch of books before this experience. And then one day I like young guy went out to a party, drank alcohol, and woke up next morning. It was all just completely gone. I spent like 7 years trying to basically get back to it, and I had quite a bit of success with some of the like Dzogchen or Zhaochen or however you pronounce
Mhm.
it. Some people have different pronunciations. And it was always it felt like I could kind of get back there, but it was a very intended, effortful thing. At this point in my life, I don't actually necessarily care that much about like the thing that I was basically seeking and sort of going out to try and get for such a long time. But that's in large part because about a year ago, I had a very different experience, which for me was just like it's changed my life more than probably anything else ever has. And like about a year ago, I was on Twitter or whatever, just being internet idiot, and I saw this guy Sam Altman. He's like the CEO of OpenAI who made ChatGPT, and he posted just this one liner. It was like a quote from Bhagavad Gita, and I hadn't read the Bhagavad Gita. I've kind of like didn't really dismiss Hinduism, but I just never really knew much about it, and I just thought it was like, oh, it's kind of like Buddhism, but maybe not. Like they kind of got it wrong. It's but I didn't have any real thoughts about it. someone I knew on this like chat room, his name's Gwern, he mentioned he's like, by the way, in that book, basically God tells this guy, you got to go kill your cousins, and he kills like thousands of people. And I was like, I don't believe, like, I couldn't even believe that because I knew it's part of the Dharmic tradition. It's very peaceful and all that sort of stuff. So I read it, although I didn't read all of it. I read like a couple pages, and the first couple pages didn't really get into much of it. But then I had this experience when I was like meditating and doing yoga, and I was doing what I now know as like pranayama breathing. And I had just this explosive, expansive experience. I think now looking back, it was like what they call like a Kundalini awakening type thing, but it felt like this energy passed through and like shot out of my forehead. And up until this point, I was very like a very like I believed ish in Buddhism, but I was very and still am very like sort of like skeptical type of person in general. I was very like atheist, rationalist, skeptical type. And so Buddhism, there are a lot of people who are like atheist Buddhists and whatnot. But I was at that point, I was like, I don't believe in karma. I never saw it, even after I had this other thing. I don't believe in rebirth. That's just all some whatever, just basically bullshit. Then this thing happened, and basically what happened is like I started, it sounds kind of crazy, but I started hearing all these voices. And I went and laid down on my bed, did a little bit more yoga, and then it just like everything changed. Like it went really dark, all these voices appeared, and I just saw basically this like chaos, like just so much craziness going around in this like kind of like black circle. And I just kind of like went with it, even though it kind of on some level was like, oh, I am going insane. This is what going insane feels like. And I saw this golden headed, four-headed face, just spiraling around, chanting some words. And now I think that seems very much like what Brahma was, like the god in Hinduism. And then after that, I went and basically it seemed like I went to about 1,000 different, I'm guessing, past lives. And I just kept going through these pretty intense experiences where like I wake up, I have my day to day, I end up dying, and I go to the next one and the next one. And it just kept happening. It felt like I was just getting pulled through this like these kind of like gates into each one. And then the last one was this very like intense experience is basically just some Indian guy who spent 40, 50 years in a cave doing crazy contortions of yoga and like really intense stuff like that. When that guy finally died, I then it just went black and it was like very beautiful, but it was just complete blackness. But then I saw this really intense like light brighter than anything I had ever seen. Very like intense. And then it turned into like basically the rainbow with like the sequential um different colors that there are. And then the last one was kind of like an indigo color, but I ne had never really seen anything like that, like that purpley color. Then I saw a blue guy for like half a second, and then he disappeared, and it was just what I now seem to believe is like the Brahmin head. So just like this giant head with infinite faces and infinite arms controlling what seemed to be everything. And the experience itself lasted like 45 minutes. And just like watching it, I could see it kind of like, it's hard to explain because it just felt like this information was getting processed into my brain, but I wasn't thinking, seeing, or hearing it. It was just coming in a way that like I don't think I could absorb information now. But just looking at it, I saw it just seemed like as I was watching it, everything made sense. Like I was complete atheist, and then this seemed like, holy shit, there actually is a God and he's controlling everything. And all the horrible things, evil, like why do bad things have to happen to kids and like all that like kind of crazy stuff. I was like, oh, it kind of makes sense, but it's just like you wouldn't be able to like accept it unless you could see how all the interconnecting parts happen. Anyway, that happened for a bit, and then I basically it seemed like I absorbed into it and I became one with it. And then it seemed like I was like almost in control of everything, like just kind of crazy sounding stuff. My girlfriend at the time was like, hey, can you turn the light off in the other room? I got up, did that, came back, and then it kind of started to dwindle away. I could still see like little things, but then it kind of basically, yeah, like kind of disappeared. I wasn't that upset about it at the time, but now I'm like, God, I should have stayed in it. What if that was like how you ascend to whatever? Um, anyway, yeah, so it was a very intensive experience, but it completely just like flipped my brain about everything that I had like initially for, because at the time I was very like, I basically had accepted just like the very intellectual idea of like, for instance, free will is clearly an illusion, which is something that's quite big in the Buddhist spectrum. Like most schools kind of believe that, but I also was like, oh, karma is bullshit and all that. As I said, this was like, oh, I got it all wrong. Like this, it seems so like empirically correct in a way where there's no confusion anymore, basically. Anyway, so that just changed from pretty much desiring, which is a bad word, but desiring to have this previous state that I wanted all the time, which just felt like this lack of self and everything was kind of perfect and you're kind of just like in this wu way, like flowing. And then this new thing happened where I'm like, oh, that's all I want. Like I want to be able to, when I meditate, just I see all the arms controlling everything again. Anyway, it was a very strange experience, but it's very much put a bit of spanner in the works of just like how I think about these things. And I still have such reverence and love and appreciation for Buddhism itself. And I know like some of the schools have so much like crossover, especially with some of the like I'm not like a complete Buddhist scholar, but I have been pretty involved in some of them. Largely they were like the Dzogchen, Vajrayana, like those sort of like Tibetan, where they have a lot of like some of them are like secretive teachings, and some of the more secretive teachings seem like, oh, it kind of does converge. But even in like the Theravada path and some of the Zen stuff, it still seems like at the end, it's almost pointing to a very similar thing. But I don't know, sometimes now I feel a little bit almost conflicted in a way where it's sometimes I feel as if some of the Buddhist path is a little bit too specific or too dogmatic about certain views, which is like whatever every most religions or belief structures have something like that. But I notice especially in Buddhism, which is just because I'm more familiar with it than other schools, a lot of the schools are like, okay, like the other schools are okay, but only we know what is true. And like all the other ones, they don't really get you to what you're trying to seek. And now I kind of feel like a different view. Like I used to be very much like I like Alan Watts and Ram Dass, and I used to think like poor Ram Dass, like he was so close, but he's like got into this Hindu shit and he's just like he got so close to the truth, which is obviously Buddhism, and poor guy. Now I kind of feel the other. I'm like, oh, this feels more true to me. Anyway, I talked for a bit, so I don't know if you have any thoughts or anything about that. I don't really know much about you in the way of like that sort of school. I know you live in India, but I don't know if you've really delved into any of the Hindu stuff. I know it's part of the culture in general there, but yeah, feel free to be like, shut up or
So,
whatever.
a couple of things I would say. One is every religion has its fair share of assholes. So basically, there's bullshit everywhere. It's all bullshit. That's the reality of experience. But it depends on what kind of uh, philosophy we want to subscribe to. There's no one reality or one truth, at least in my way of looking at things. Um, your experience, is your experience, and nobody can take that away from you. And this is very important to understand for a lot of practitioners is many times not everything can be explained by a specific sect or a specific school or a specific um, religion or tradition or whatever you want to call it. Um, to me, when you were explaining all of this, it sounded to me like a DMT trip. Like people when they go through certain psychedelic experiences will have something like this, and they might see the Godhead and then become the Godhead, and so on and so. So,
Yeah,
um, excuse me. I think
it seems to be
I think
consistent
people's
breathing things
yeah,
as well,
yeah,
which
yeah, exactly. And people's experiences um are like we have to understand they are the stepping stones into a greater world of wisdom, which isn't just Buddhism or Hinduism or Christian mysticism or Judaism or whatever, but there is an underlying understanding behind all of it or underneath all of it, which is that what Christians might call God or Hindus might call Brahman or Buddhists might call the Dhammakaya, or the clear light mind, or Nibbana or Nirvana, or the Kabbalists will call it like the Ein Sof. All of these are like interpretations for our limited human capacity of understanding,
Mm,
to be like, okay, that's what it is. So every time we look for an answer into an experience, it's, of course, one is to really make sense of the experience, but we can only do so once we come back into the limited understanding. Because we look back and reflect on that amazing, brilliant memory of an experience, but it's our minds or our brains that is interpreting what's going on based on the information that we've gathered so far.
yeah.
It cannot be outside of the scope of that, outside of the scope of mental conditioning.
Mm. I think that's a good point. I and one thing that I had thought about with these sorts of things is like I know in even the like classical Buddhist traditions, you had Buddha who was very clearly like here's this hierarchy and this is how you get to this highest level. And then you had people like Sariputta, or I might be pronouncing it wrong, Sariputta. I read a lot, but I don't pronounce it much, where he basically, confirmed he hit a hardship, like he hit the highest level. But when you actually look at like the things he had, whether it's cities or like having past life reoccurrences, he didn't really have much of those sorts of things. But still within that tradition, he's like, but he still achieved this highest level. And so sometimes I wonder if it's like it is this sort of thing you're saying, like people have different paths and they're capable of maybe seeing different things, but like you can still have this sort of like transcendent wisdom, yet
Mm.
it's in a different encapsulation for you than say somebody else. And one thing I mean, it's always going to be speculation, but one thing I was always curious about is like when you look at Buddha and talking about the self, or like taking the noble silence, where he didn't really expand on the self question much, or Brahman, or like what is the start of the
Yeah.
universe, what happens at the end. For me, that always made me feel a little bit like it's weird to me to not speak on it. It almost hints at like maybe he had this deeper realization and he didn't want that to muddy the waters of his teachings, because he knows not everyone's going to be able to get that. And I know with a lot of these things, some things were put in later and it's hard to know. And there's things about like future predictions he had about like whatever that might be, like Padmasambhava coming and stuff like that, where it's like, did he really say that? Was that putting like all those sorts of things? But anyway, for me, it was, yeah, that's how I was thinking about it. But who knows? It's all going to be speculation. And as you said, it's your path is different than everyone else's. So,
Yeah, and I mean, coming back to, let's say, looking at the words of the Buddha, the traditionalists will say that the Theravadins right now, who are the sort of the one of the ultra orthodox, and within Theravada communities, there's levels of orthodoxy on that as well, I would say. I mean, but we won't get too much into it because I've seen the extremes of that. I've seen people who get very, very attached to a certain kind of view, and they make it their whole life, and they basically spew vitriol, to
mm,
whoever feels like it's something different than what they know to be the truth. But what I'll say is, as far as my understanding goes, when I've studied the Theravada text, is that the Buddha talked about the handful of leaves simile, which is a beautiful simile, if it is really his words, but it's in it nonetheless a beautiful simile. Simile. What he says is, um, there are these trees of the forest behind me, and here I have a handful of leaves. And so he asks to his students, which is greater, the handful of leaves or the leaves on the leaves on the trees of the forest behind me? And obviously they say the forest. He said, that may be so, but what I teach is only this handful of leaves for the purpose of understanding how to let go of suffering. If we go to like the core depth of what the Buddha is really going after, is like, how do I eliminate, or if not eliminate, at least alleviate suffering in my life? And so these handful of leaves, which is the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, the mindfulness of breathing, and so on and so forth, loving kindness, and everything else that's in the package of Buddhism, is what he teaches. Doesn't mean that he doesn't know what else is beyond, for the purposes of experience of existence. so I think a good way of looking at it is that if if his lane, so to speak, his drive down this existence was basically like, my purpose is to understand suffering and how to relieve it, and then show people that, then I'm going to stick to my lane and not move around from place to place. There are a few circumstances here and there where he talks about the future, he talks about, this is what happened in the past, but it's very, very interspersed. I mean, it's very brief, but in most cases, he's really just talking about this. And if you think about Hinduism, I mean, you asked me earlier, like what my experience with that is. So I started off with yoga. I started off with yoga philosophy and Vedanta when I was about 16. I was expelled from school and decided to basically go on my own to the Himalayas with a teacher of mine who was a teacher at school, and he was also a yogi. And he started me on the path of Vedanta. And I studied the works of people like Swami Vivekananda and the Bhagavad
Sorry,
Gita,
it just cut out after you said Swami Vivekananda.
which is an interesting text in and of itself. And Swami Vivekananda, like he is one of the lions of Vedanta. Like he was one of the first Indian monks who went to the US in Chicago, and he gave that very famous speech where he started off with, they're sisters and brothers of America, and it got a standing ovation, so they say. But my point is, I went through Vedanta and I also studied the Bhagavad Gita. And one comment I'll have about the Bhagavad Gita is, anybody who wants to set up shop as a Vedantaries, commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, commentary on the Yoga Sutras, and a commentary on the Upanishads.
Uh, so was that by
It's
Swami
like
Vivekananda, or it just
it's
cut out? Cut
that's
out.
how you know you're a teacher. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry, it cut out a bit. Were you talking about Swami
What was
Vivekananda?
that? Sorry. I think it's my internet here.
Yeah, sorry about that. I think, yeah, the internet cut out. I was asking, was that Swami
Oh,
Vivekananda?
okay.
Sorry. Oh no. I hope it's not. I don't know.
Oh, who said that?
Yeah, sorry, it did cut out the internet for a second. Apologize. Can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, no, so Swami Vivekananda, yeah, yeah. Can you hear me? I don't know if this is any better.
It
Yeah,
is.
okay. All right, well, we'll figure that out. So what I was saying about Swami Vivekananda is like he was one of the lions of Vedanta. Like he took it upon himself as his mission to go to the West and start to teach the stuff that he had learned and realized for himself and from his teacher Ramakrishna. And I studied the works of Swami Vivekananda, and separate to that, I also studied the Bhagavad Gita because you mentioned it earlier. It's a very interesting text, and the comment I was giving is that that many of these neo-Vedantin non-dualist teachers, and even the older traditional teachers, it's like if you want to be a teacher, you set up shop by offering these three commentaries: a commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, commentary on Yoga Sutras, and a commentary on the Upanishads or any other Vedantic text. And so my point about that is the Bhagavad Gita is so stained at this point in our evolution with so many different commentaries that everybody has their own understanding of it. And I don't know if anybody out there has a clean version of the Bhagavad Gita, but one of my more favorite translations is one by a guy named um, Bibek Debroy, Bibek, Bibek Debroy, Debroy. Like it's one of the more straightforward translations without any agenda. I've noticed like teachings of the Bhagavad Gita or translations of the Bhagavad Gita have a certain kind of agenda behind it, to basically say this is what Krishna is saying about Vedanta, or this is what Krishna is saying about yoga, this is what he's saying about non-dualism. But the reality of it is, in the Bhagavad Gita, yes, it starts off with, this battlefield where this guy, Arjuna, is feeling like he doesn't want to kill his cousins, and rightly so. And Krishna says, he starts off with saying that, well, we've gotten this far, and you have to decide what you want to do. And he's like, but my mind is unsteady. I don't know what I should be doing. And Krishna does say, like, basically, he doesn't instruct Arjuna or command him to kill anybody. He just says, in our tradition and in our culture, as warriors, our duty is to fight against any kind of injustice.
Mm.
And so he often quotes and says, it is spoken of in the traditions. People or wise men have said. And the beauty of the dialogue is that it goes really deep into the understanding of Brahman, the Atman, the self, and so on. And then it goes back into like the practicals of things like the personality types, the kind of ways that people will behave according to their personality types. It's very detailed. And at the very end, he tells Arjuna, Krishna says, okay, I've told you everything, but now it's your decision what you want to do. I'm not going to tell you how you should go about doing it. You decide how you want to go ahead. And I think that's a great lesson for teachers and students alike, is find a teacher who doesn't say, do as I say, not as I do. And this is the truth and this is the only truth. And ultimately, it is up to you, as a practitioner of spirituality, how you want to go about doing this. So that's one comment I'll have about the Bhagavad Gita. The other thing I want to say is, the self versus no self debate, for lack of a better word, that's there. I think I would speculate that the Buddha was looking at Nibbana as something that is a substrate. He didn't call it a self, but he also understood that around that time of ancient India and during the time of the Upanishads, there is a concept of self as Sat Chit Ananda. Right? This is a Sanskrit word. Sat means self-existing. Chit means consciousness, and Ananda means bliss. And so, if the self is Sat Chit Ananda, all he was saying is basically from via negativa. That is to say, looking at all of our experiences, the body, the mind, feeling, perceptions, intentions, choices, consciousness of sense bases, and so on. If you look at it, it is conditioned, but the self remains unconditioned. And therefore, that which is conditioned and is dependent is subject to pass away when those conditions are gone. Therefore, you cannot hold on to them as self, because even if they're pleasant sensations or bring a sense of ananda, a sense of bliss, eventually they go away. So you can't call it the true self. You cannot call it self. So the Buddha never really mentioned that there is no self, but what he did say is that all our experience cannot be said as self. He did say there is that space that is unconditioned and that is absolute. And he gave that name Nirvana or Nibbana, and among many other names. Like he even called it Shiva, the auspicious. He
Mm.
called it the refuge, the sanctuary, and so on and so forth. So, these are things that people don't really discuss. I don't know why, but it should be discussed more.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's one thing I've seen with Buddhism in general, where it's like, as you mentioned, in the specific initial text, like the Pāli Canon, he doesn't actually say it, but from what I've seen, almost every single tradition of Buddhism is very, very precise on this one thing about self and no self. And you said there's a bit of a debate. I actually didn't know, because almost everyone that I've heard who is involved with, say, Buddhism, it's very clear there's no self. There's no wiggle room at all. There is no self. And I don't know if that's just like that's what has been developed and that's the way it went or what. I do think him leaving it silent does lead to it's gonna go on like people are they're gonna have conclusions. They're gonna come to it. Um, and for me, I always felt like I more appreciated that because I was very like I was atheist. I was like, there's clearly no God, all this, but I also was like the rebirth stuff didn't make sense. But now kind of looking sort of back on it with this perspective of like I've seen this thing, whether that was actually what I thought it was, whether it, as you said, maybe it was I did crazy breathing, which I had never done before this experience, but it like just came out of me. I just like did this strange breathing. Um, and I actually have another person coming on my podcast who his name is Dakota of Earth. He's got this YouTube channel. He's a younger guy, and he travels around India and that sort of thing. And he actually gave I can't remember the name, a sannyasi, or I can't remember what it is, but some pretty dedicated Hindu monk style guy who was hanging out with him, and he gave him like DMT to smoke basically. And on camera he says like this he does it and he has pretty intense experience, and he said this is the same as the pranayama.
Yeah.
It's the same sort of thing, but pranayama takes a while. And actually, in my own experience, I don't know if you don't want me to talk about this or whatever, but I've done DMT a whole bunch of times, and yeah, it definitely had the same sort of flavor. I guess the thing for me that was very different was just one, the length of it. DMT is usually a thing that's like 5, 10 minutes, and then two, just the vividness of this was it was unreal, and also it felt like it just felt so different. There's really no way to sort of, in my opinion, encapsulate it to other people where it is going to make sense and it's not going to just sound like this weird hallucinatory thing. But for me, it really had this flavor of like I'm very much, I've understood probability theory enough that like anything, I'm like 99% chance this is true. Like I'll always leave a bit of a gap because I know who knows, like you never know what's going to happen. That felt like the first thing in my entire life where I was like 100% this feels real. Like right now doesn't feel this feels like 99% real, but like that felt like there was 100% no doubt. There's this weird empirical thing where like I can't explain it, but this feels like the whole shebang's like everything is leading into this. Like this is kind of the point of life. Not that you have to necessarily follow this point, but for me it felt like really this is it. Like that's it. And yeah, so and yeah, I guess that's one of the things that where I wanted to speak about where it's like my whole thing now is like I don't know if you call it Jivan Mukti or what, but I want the ability to re-enter that because having been in there
Yeah.
and then coming back from it, it's not like I'm always happy. I feel like a happy person, but it feels like something's just missing from your life once you see it, at least in my perspective. And maybe um, I don't know, doing this whole
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
chase thing, which I know Buddhists in general are very like, that's the whole point, dude. You can't be chasing, otherwise you're just gonna drive yourself insane, miss the whole point.
yeah. Well, one thing I would say about this, again, going back a little bit to the self versus no self thing. Yeah, I think one thing we would look at it is that there's no personal self. And I think Theravadins would agree on this perspective, which is that there's no there's no personal independent self. And that's what they believe, which is to say that there is there's a series of processes that are going on that are interdependent upon one another.
Mm,
Um, and then the Atman that's mentioned in Vedanta and Hinduism is really that unconditioned experience, which is and it's for whatever reason, it's been translated as self because it says it's your true nature, it's the underlying current behind all experience and existence and beings and so on and so forth. But the word Atman, it comes from Atmos, which is a Proto-Indo-European word for breath or vitality. So if anything else, it's really life energy. And what it's saying is that the entire universe is teeming with life energy. So it goes beyond just self in terms of, hey, this is me, this is the ego kind of thing, which I think what most Theravadins are pointing out is like the ego that we see is not the real self, but that there is underlying. But I don't think Theravadins will agree when I say this, that there is an underlying life energy behind every experience and every form of existence. And
yeah,
I
that
tend to look at it in that way.
That seems blasphemous a little bit. Well, not to me, but from what I do with the Theravadins, it's very much like what is going through these past lives. It basically, it's always kind of confused me a little bit because it's basically like it doesn't exist. There's nothing there, but what's happening is these karmic imprints are just like manifesting, and for some reason you can see
Right.
that, but the thing you call self is not it. And sometimes I feel like maybe it's a little bit of a semantic game a little bit, because sometimes
Right.
I feel like what
Yes.
they're referring to self might just be different. Because at the end of the day, most people have never really thought about like what is the self, unless you are basically Buddhist or you're like a philosophy
Yeah.
major. And so I sometimes I feel like maybe
Yeah.
what they're calling self is different, because I do know for me at least it did feel like these other lives, or what I'm taking to be other lives, they did feel different than me. Like the thing that was observing didn't feel like who I am, my personality, but there's
Yes.
some
Right.
aspects of it where I'm like, okay, anyway, interesting.
Right. Right. So you mentioned the term Jivan Mukta, which is or Jivan Mukti, which is a term that mostly is used in ancient Vedantic perspectives, and
Yes.
it's essentially this idea that we are liberated while living, or we can be liberated while alive, because the traditionalists will say that moksha or freedom is only attained at death, and so that's videha mukha, But videha mukti, and in this case, jivan mukti, I think that is probably a better place to be than being like going through all this shit, and then at the end of it, you have moksha. It's My preference would be why not Jivan Mukti?
Yeah, I mean, me too. That's why I feel I really don't think this is worth getting into, but I saw one video you had. I was like a little bit like slightly critical, where you said something about just we'll never be able to solve aging itself. Like this is a problem that just will never happen. I'm a little bit more optimistic, and I feel like some of the things, it's like there are certain biological things, like jellyfish, for instance, that can seem to regenerate their own cells and
Right,
essentially live
right.
forever. But
Yeah.
regardless, I don't really have a fear of death anymore. I'm not one of those people where it's like it's a big concern where I'm scared and I'm atheist where that's it. So I don't really necessarily care, but I do feel like this idea of like, yeah, Jivan Mukti, where it's like after all my researching and stuff, it seems like a lot of people achieve what I guess you would call like a low level moksha, where it's like a liberation while you're still alive, but they don't necessarily have
Yes.
this thing that it seems like what I had or whatever, which is this like Vishvarupa type thing, which was very clearly what Arjuna had. But it seemed like a lot of people would say like Jivan Mukti, that can be that, like that bit can be where you can actually basically have this experience of merging with the divine consciousness or Godhead or whatever you want to refer to it, the Big Bang. Sometimes I feel almost like and I'll probably get the term, I probably won't even try, but the independent origination, that sort of
Yeah. Yeah.
thing, like, or Indra's, like it's sometimes almost they feel like they're trying to sort of paint a similar picture, but it's a different sort of like categorization than
Yes.
this interconnected Godhead, which is controls. And one of the things that I saw with it, it was very much like it didn't feel like an entity in the normal way people say entities, because it's
That's
constantly,
right.
and it feels like this matrix bottom layer of like anyway, it was a pretty insane thing to see, but yeah.
So, I'm going to have to recommend, I mean, even on this podcast, which is you should probably get this person as a guest. He's a good friend of mine. His name is Ryan Burton. So shout out to Ryan. He has had a
Burton?
myriad of experiences. He has a site called After Awakening, and he does, weekly classes and things like that. But he and I have traveled together quite a bit. He attended one of my retreats, and then we became good friends after that. And we traveled in India, and he travels quite a bit. He's also a meditation teacher, and this is an ongoing conversation that we have oftentimes in between jokes and sharing reels and memes and things like that. But the conversations that we have are related to, like this this entity that you're calling, this entity is outside of the scope of normal consciousness, for lack of a better word, quote unquote normal.
Yep.
It's like, we have a term called Purusha in yoga, and there's the Purusha Suktam, which is a brilliant, interesting Vedic hymn, which says it is the one with the thousand eyes and the thousand heads and the thousand arms. And it works through a thousand times, a thousand times, a thousand. It's like it's everywhere, all pervading, and it is the function of the universe. It is the universe itself. So there is truth to it, I think. It's not like, and if, let's say if it's just an experience,
For
let's
Buddhist
say if
paradigm.
it's just a conditioned experience, right? So what? There is something about it that so many people across multiple generations in many different traditions have had. So Ryan and I always talk about this is like, well, the traditional Buddhists will be like, no, 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 we can't say that. But then this is our real this is our real experience. We have tapped into it. How can we just say that that's just the mind playing tricks on us? I think it's more than that. Definitely more than that.
So how did you spell his last name? Ryan. I couldn't see.
Burton, Burton.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, look, for me, it's less about an experience of like I'm trying to say convince you or convince other people. For me, it's like there is that one part of me where it's like for me, this was the peak. This was, oh my God, this is everything I've ever experienced, and I do feel like other people experiencing it would be a good thing for them. So there is that little bit, but for me, it's more like maybe this is selfish, but I'm like, I want to be able to have it again. Like I would like to achieve, or I know that's not a good word, especially in the lexicon. And I do think, I don't know if he's said that he's also seen these things, this Ryan guy, but I do feel like so when it happened to me, I had only read a couple pages and it didn't explain any of that. Like, so it didn't get to where this thing had happened. So for me, the synchronicity of like reading 2 pages and then finishing that book that week after that had happened was very like, holy shit, this is explaining exactly the thing that happened to me,
Yeah.
minus the past lives. They didn't talk about that. But I see why in the story Arjuna is terrified by this thing because it wasn't the Christian conception of God. It was this quite terrifying thing. I mean, I still found it beautiful and blissful, and it didn't seem to make me mentally unstable or anything like that. But I could see very clearly, like, oh, it makes sense to me when, like, holy shit, it's almost like I had had something previously, not this intense, but something that many years before with slight aids of more experience, like drug sort of experience. I had something which I thought was like I can never say her name or his name, mantra of, sorry, the Buddha of compassion with infinite arms. I've always,
Right. Right.
Abel- I can never say that name. I'm so bad with
Yeah,
them.
me too. Me too. I know who you're talking about.
Um, But I thought it was that because it seemed little, not demony, but like for maybe just my Western mind of like anything that's not the classical angel looking thing seems demony. But it had these crazy arms, and I just saw it for like a split couple of maybe like a minute or so. So it wasn't the same thing at all. Anyway, one thing I did find very interesting, especially just with what you're saying, where it's like it seems like we tapped into the thing. So like, how can you deny your empirical experience? One thing that I found very interesting with it is because I was in it for a bit. Like it wasn't just come and gone. And one thing I did, I like explored, so I could see how it was basically controlling individual people, but then also like interactions between them and then other things like emotions and stuff like that. But the lowest level that I went is I saw a rock. Like it seemed like an arm was in a rock. And so for me that I don't know if you've ever heard this term panpsychism, but it's just like modern
Yes.
science theory, which basically says the universe itself is alive, like everything's alive, like the smallest atom, like everything. And for me, that seems to hold true to some extent. I was like, this is some. Um, One small other thing, I'm sorry, I'm long-winded, is it is interesting to me as well. One thing I always thought about is like if you go back in evolution, if you go back far enough, you and me are related, some distant way. But then you go back and you and your dog are related, and actually, you and every biological thing we can see they believe, from one universal common ancestor. But when you really think about it, it's like everything itself came from the Big Bang, and it's actually not that it came from it. We are just these little
Yes.
we complicated patterns that we are just the Big Bang. Like there's actually no distinction between that and us. It's just we put these dividers, which is yeah. Anyway, I'll stop talking because I'll never shut up. Um, well, if you have comment, otherwise I have a bunch of other topics that I'd love to talk. If
Yeah, no, I mean, one thing I would just say about that is, yeah, I think it's so interesting because we have animism, which is really one of the oldest traditions in most tribal religions, so-called tribal religions, is the idea that everything is alive. And here we come to this more fancy way of saying it, which is panpsychism. But I think there is some iota of relevance to it because now consciousness, the hard problem of consciousness is something that continues to elude us as humanity, and what is consciousness and so on. But you look back into the old texts, it just says the universe is consciousness, everything is consciousness, and every tradition has its own interpretation of that. um anyway, I mean, I'll stop there and then we'll continue with other questions or topics.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm happy to just talk and feel free whenever you're like, oh, I gotta go, whatever. I have a bit of time, but I'm happy to do whatever. But I mean, I guess I could probably talk about this forever, especially because there's no one, at least in my actual physical life, where I can talk about and I'm like, hey, here's this thing. And actually, even like sort of like online communities and stuff that I've been part of, um, I have a lot of friends who they're like very rational atheist people who they've gone into maybe a little bit more Buddhist stuff, but still this conception of like if you bring up Atman, they basically throw this look like, dude, you're like you're an idiot basically, like you're completely missing the point. And I've actually talked with a bunch of different people who have either the claim of enlightenment or they kind of hint at it or whatever it might be. And I remember one of them was mentioning he's like I've done them all. I've done moksha, and he's like it's not as high level as Buddhist enlightenment. And I remember he said that, which is like, oh wow, that's impressive, whatever. And then later I saw him talk about how like basically he's never had something super out of distribution with his consciousness, like nothing that would hint at anything like kind of like crazy or weird. Like it was all just like this clarity of like Buddhist insight, which for me seemed a very strange thing to pair with. I've had moksha, but I've never seen things like that because like the idea of like oh like and he was very dogmatic about self and stuff as well, which I completely understand. I was up until a year ago, but yeah, it struck me as weird to be like, oh, I've achieved moksha, but then also like Brahman is clearly not real. I didn't realize Atman and self is one. Um, I might wait. I don't know if you're still there. Oh yeah, it cut out. Anyway, yeah. Look, I might maybe go a little bit of a curveball. One thing that I thought would be an interesting thing to speak with you specifically about is I didn't haven't finished all of it, but I read some of The Red Serpent. I don't know if you still talk about that or if you don't like talking about that or if you just changed tune completely.
Wow, that's like a different lifetime ago.
Okay. Okay.
No, we can talk about that. Yeah, yeah, we can talk about that. But that's like some of that was literally oh uh, 15 years ago, 14 years ago, something like that. So yeah, we could talk about it. It's something I haven't spoken about in a long time. I'm
Well,
I'm
we
I'm
don't
surprised it's still
necessarily
up there. Yeah.
necessarily have to. I mean, it's like I got the audiobook of it and I actually don't know if you finished it or whatever
Oh,
as well. Like, did you finish the series or not necessarily?
so there are 3 books out there, and there are still some books yet to be launched or released. And it's just for me to go through the editing process and getting it out there. So there are a few more books on the way.
Yeah, cool. Well, look, I don't need to talk about it, and I haven't read all of it. I'm like a little under halfway. I don't know about you if this is the same for you, but for me, I used to love reading and stuff, but my appetite for non-dharmic text is just like non-existent. Like it's so hard for me. When I start reading something, I'm like,
Yeah.
I could be reading Patanjali or like this fucking millionth time that I've read whatever it might be. There's a lot of Buddhist books that I've read, and now since a year ago, it's gone completely basically Hinduism. I've read the Bhagavad Gita. The translation I read was from this guy Eknath Esaran. Probably pronouncing it wrong.
Right.
But I think he's actually got two translations in the book that I
I know who you're talking about. Yeah.
loved it. It was the first one I read. I've read commentaries by Osho, but that's about it. But I do want to digest more of these because it's one of those things like when you really do get into something, when you see the translations, it's very interesting. I've read like back before I was even really that into Buddhism, I read the Tao Te Ching, and it's such a small book, so you can really just you can get through it pretty quick. But I've read like 8 or 9 translations, and yeah, it's always a little bit different. I guess the question I was going to ask more is just you said this was a lifetime ago, so you might not have any thoughts on it, but more, I've had these things and I've enjoyed writing, and it's really about the conversion of them, about spiritual insights and wisdom within prose, within fiction, maybe specifically sci-fi fantasy. That's the kind of stuff that I like. Do you have feelings about that? I'm watching this show, Wheel of Time. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but the story
Oh
itself.
yeah, I've heard of it. That's the yeah, that's who was that by? What was the
Robert
author's
Jordan,
name?
I think is his name.
Right.
Robert Jordan, I think.
Robert Jordan. Yeah. Yeah, it's a big epic
Yeah, I
um
never read it. It's like
series of books.
huge.
Right.
But even then,
Yeah.
even the name Wheel of Time, I mean, that's clearly a Dharmic reference. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, sci-fi has always been part of my growing up. When I was about 5 or 6 years old, we had a neighbor. He was actually our landlord, living in New York, and he had a big collection of different video cassettes. At the time, it was video cassettes, right? It was the 90s. And he had a series called Star Wars. And he said, "You have to watch this." As a little kid, he told me, "You got to watch this." And so I remember watching the first one, which nowadays is episode 4, A New Hope. And I was like, "Wow, this is something else." And then I was like, "I want to watch the next one." He gave me Empire Strikes Back, and then finding out that Darth Vader is actually Luke Skywalker's father is like, "Whoa, how is that possible?" And then Return of the Jedi. As a little kid, I called it Jedi, and then my landlord would be like, "No, no, it's Jedi, Jedi. Remember, it's Jedi." So I watched that, and I was so enamored by the world building of that particular franchise. And I had a love of reading as well. I mean, I was very young. I started my process of reading motivated by, there was a program in the US, where for every 10 books you read that summer, you would get a free pizza at Pizza Hut. So I read about 60 books that summer. Yeah, it was small little books, but that kind of got me into the literary world of sci-fi and fantasy. And then Lord of the Rings was coming out again as a movie franchise. And so I got into that. And I got inspired by Tolkien and his like ability to build worlds through language and culture and history. And I was always like, I want to do something like that at some point. And that, along with my fascination with ancient Indian history, and then also the spiritual undercurrents of the Force and the Jedi versus Sith, all of that kind of came into a big explosion of like, if I can somehow be able to write, but also convey spiritual insights into my writing, whether it's fiction or even just talking about my own experiences, that would be a dream come true. And so Red Serpent, was sort of that. It was a culmination of all of my influences growing up, plus my spiritual insights. So for those of you who would be interested in reading or listening to the audiobook of Red Serpent, at least the very first book, there's near-death experiences in there, which were kind of based on my own experiences. And there's also like encounters with different beings and a godhead and all of this stuff that
Mm.
happens, and a dialogue very much similar like the Bhagavad Gita. It happens towards the end of the book, I think. So um, it was a lot of fun to write, and it was one of the first sort of ways of my ability to convey spirituality in this way.
Yeah, great. Look, that's extra motivation. I'll definitely finish it then because yeah, that was something that like I had no idea if you had any sort of like Hindu knowledge or anything besides the peripheral like you I actually don't know if you are Indian, but besides the fact that you live there, like everyone in India knows, they know the stories, they know about Krishna. Yeah, that's awesome. I think it definitely seems to be a beneficial thing because you're writing now. Like I've read a couple of your current books that you've been releasing under the TWIM um I guess it's under the trim apparatus. I don't know how you refer to it
Right.
or what sort of thing is going on there. But yeah, you're definitely a very concise and clear writer, which, it seems like Dharmic sort of knowledge helps people with that in general because you're getting very precise, like laser focused on speaking about things that are often very nebulous, but they not everyone can do it. So you've definitely done it. So that's good. Um, have you
Yeah, I
read
appreciate it.
any, do you have specific writers in Dharmic traditions that you specifically like? For me, he never gets that much acclaim, but Tulku Urgyen Rinpoche is one of my favorites for whatever reason. His writing to me is really just like, yeah, I loved it.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a lot of his videos. There are a few pointing out instructions of his that are just phenomenal. Like it's just like clear cut. Like this is what it is. Um, interesting. I had a chance to meet with his son, Mingyur Rinpoche,
Oh, he's
in
a
India. Yeah, and he
character, but he's
he has
so
a very interesting life story as well. So I had a chance to get an autograph of his book and everything. But in terms of writers in the Dharmic community, it's a good question because um, I haven't really read much except for, let's say, the Pāli Canon, and that too. I'm still going through it. The things that I enjoy doing of all things is going back to the old texts and trying to find good translation of the old text, whether it's Hinduism or Buddhism, and then just using my meditation and insight and capacities to kind of figure out what is being said.
mm,
So, like we have in ancient India, the Puranas. Purana actually literally means old, epic. And there are 18 major Puranas, which are all dealing with different kinds of deities and things like that. But there's the Garuda Purana, which is like an epic DMT trip through the realms of hell and heaven and like how karma works and all of these very, very interesting notions that are there. And I'm somebody who people don't maybe generally know this about me as a teacher is I'm very deeply fascinated by um, subjects that are not necessarily that are on the fringe, let's say, for lack of a better word. It's like they're subjects that are very deep spirituality, deep into like the essence of what is meditation, what people will call the occult. Occult has a bad reputation among some people, but it's basically like tantra. Tantra is a big thing now in the West,
mm,
but I don't think anybody knows a goddamn thing about tantra in reality in the West. They all think they do, but the real people who know tantra you are not going to see on YouTube, not going to see them talking about it because there's so much. What people have seen in the world of tantra is just a small iceberg
mm.
of it's just the tip of the iceberg, small tip of the iceberg, and underneath it there is so much there. And so I have the added benefit of knowing Sanskrit, reading and understanding Sanskrit so that I can look at these obscure texts. If somebody asks me what am I doing lately in my free time, it is going through these obscure books. I'm like sort of like Gandalf or Dumbledore, going to the Forbidden Library and looking at all of these really, really ancient, obscure texts. Because I just have a fascination. It's from a past life. I have a fascination.
Interesting. Look, yeah, I'm right there with you. It's only really been a year that I've been more involved with actually having any interest in some of this esoteric stuff, and some of it as well that I've been looking into is the more Western stuff as well, where they call it like esoterica or yeah, occult. And some of it is definitely like you could see why it has a bad name because some of it is definitely bad. It's like demonology or but often even within those texts, it's like
Yes.
they're like, by the way, this isn't these demons, they're like they're not going to possess you. They could, but you're going to use them for potentially good, and that seems to be what people are typically using. I'm curious if you've ever read I almost want to try, but I feel like I never should, but it's like Vigyan Bhairava Tantra, which is like the 112
Yes.
meditation techniques by I can't remember if it was claimed to be Shiva himself wrote it or something like that. That's what I thought, but maybe I completely got that wrong. But there's a bunch of
Yeah.
different translations. Osho did one.
So yes, yes. Osho has a one called the Book of Secrets,
Mm,
which is like a huge 2 volume kind of commentary on the Vijnana Bhairav Tantra, which is just basically his talks on it. But the Vijnana Bhairav Tantra is a dialogue. It's so yeah. So whenever you see the word tantra in these books, it means technique or
mm,
series of techniques. So we have three things: tantra, yantra, and mantra. Tantra means technique because it's basically using the body and mind. So tan is actually body, tantra. Man is mind, mantra. So you're using a certain kind of chant or something to bring the mind to more focus, to more collectedness. And yantra literally means machine. So like it could be like a seal, like Solomon's seal, or you see like the Mount Meru or the Sri Yantra that a lot of people might have nowadays. Those are all yantras. Those are machines, meaning they are basically encapsulating the energy and creating the blueprint or energy pattern that is required to hold a specific kind of energy. So the Vigyan Bhairav Tantra is a series of techniques of how to center the mind and come to that space of ananda, of bliss beyond just the body and mind, but utilizing the body, utilizing the mind. And when I was in San Diego for about 6 years, I was delving deep into the Vigyan Bhairav Tantra. It's a dialogue between Shiva and Parvati. And so Vigyan means the science, and Bhairav is a name of Shiva, which is basically the more fiercer form of the fiercer form of Shiva. And it's divided up into different techniques, like using the breath, using movement, using space, using visualization techniques, and so on. And the idea is each one can be a portal to the ultimate, can be a portal to that experience. So each technique can be used in one lifetime, but one person can just make that their technique. Like the anapanasati, which is the mindfulness of breathing in Theravada Buddhism or Buddhism in general. You're going to find that in the Vijnana Bhairav Tantra. Um, Many of the techniques that are mentioned in a lot of Buddhist schools, you're going to find in the Vijnana Bhairav Tantra. So it's a very useful book, but it's something that requires really careful and dedicated study.
mm. Yeah, because I felt like with Osho's sort of interpretation of it, it felt a little bit different the way he sort of encapsulated it. And the reason I brought it up is because we are talking about like different journeys and that sort of thing. His seemed to be like, here's a bit of a banquet. You're gonna find the one thing that is gonna be yours. Like you're gonna just once you read it, once you do it, you'll know if it connects with you or not. But one of these in these 112 is gonna be something that you found useful. I definitely, yeah, there was one in particular where I was like, ooh, for whatever reason, this framing really sort of, yeah, interesting. I don't mean to try to hold you on something specifically, and feel free to just not or just like avoid it. But you've talked about these things, these texts, these Godhead figures, these sorts of things. Does that mean that you sort of do believe maybe a little bit? It's not that believing in say Brahman is antithetical to Buddhism, but from what I've seen from my experiences is if you are Buddhist, you basically can it's not you cannot accept it. It's actually very like it works very well together. But everyone that I've seen, especially higher up
Right.
people, they're very specific. They're very like this is the way it is.
Yeah.
There is no God. There's only Buddhahood or whatever above
Yeah.
it. Some places in
I've
Thailand is pretty into Brahma, and even some of the Theravadas,
yes,
Brahma exists, but not actually Brahman. And anyway,
right. And that's a interesting point you bring up. I'll bring up. I'll talk about that. I'll touch upon it a bit. But in terms of my own experience, yeah, I mean, I have had experience of Brahman. I've had experience of Atman. I've had experience of becoming one with the universe, and in many different ways through meditation, through some use of different kinds of substances. Um, through retreats, dark retreats, and also through just like near-death experiences as well, and really going and tapping into those experiences and seeing what that is. So that's what I'm saying. For myself, at least, I cannot deny it. I mean, there is something there. Um, I am, for all intents and purposes, a spiritual entertainer. So I basically am going by what my audience wants to hear. You know, people don't like to be told what to do. They keep saying, no, no, tell me what I should say, what I should do. Tell me the ultimate truth. But I can see in their minds that they're just not willing to really see it for themselves. And if I tell them something that is, as you say, antithetical to Buddhism or Theravada Buddhism, then I'm seen as an heretic. And at this point, I really don't give a fuck. It doesn't matter now anymore. I
Mm.
can say what I want to say, and people who want to hear about it can hear it and decide if they want to know more about it, or they can go elsewhere. And the reason I'm saying this in these terms is because now my experiences through my 18, 19 years of practice, but beyond that, my many lifetimes of practice, and then beyond that, my many lifetimes of teaching experience as well. And then now here, being in the modern day where we are in the last, the 21st century teaching, I see that people have a tendency to have some kind of skin in the game, whether they're teachers or students or practitioners. And what I'm saying is, fuck it all. Just no skin in the game at all. I will say what I feel like I want to say because it's my experience and because it rings true for me. In the past, as a spiritual entertainer, I had to be beholden to a specific set of dogma and principles, and I still continue to do that. As a so-called spiritual entertainer, I have my circuit. I do my rounds of retreats in the US, my rounds of retreats in Europe. That's how I earn my bread and butter, right? But if you were to talk to me one-on-one about deeper secrets, if I were to just talk about this to the usual crowd that I usually work with, they get more bogged down in the dogma of it, and there's a bit of resistance there that I cannot penetrate unless they're ready to, listen about it. So my spiritual career as a teacher started off in Buddhism, started off as a teacher of Buddhism because of my experiences with Buddhism. But does that mean that it discounts my experiences with yoga and Vedanta? Certainly not. And this is why I'm scoping out and expanding and saying, look, everybody's experience is valid. And if we try to limit it in the scope of it's just the, arising and passing away of something, or it's just, not self, or, we say that from the Hindu perspective, that what they're saying is, oh, they're talking about Brahma and not Brahman and so on, then that defeats the purpose. That defeats the purpose. The claim of having ultimate truth is one thing, but then saying that all others are untrue because of that ultimate truth is delusional.
Mm.
Because I really see from my own experience is that there are multiple pathways to this so-called ultimate truth. And we can call it whatever you want. We can call it the flying spaghetti monster. We can call it the Brahman. We can call it God. We can call it Nirvana, whatever it is. But ultimately, it is just one perspective from the prism of that ultimate.
Interesting. I wonder if there's any part of this which is like maybe enjoying writing and coming up with stories makes you more able to be like, I'll digest everything. I don't have to be like, this is right or wrong. But
Yeah,
I think because I know for me, some of these things where I'm like, this seems silly, or I'll look at like specific like Peruvian mythology, which has really got nothing to do with what we do. But I'm like, it's interesting to me. I might put it in a story. I might like, and so I wonder if there's a little bit there. But also with that, one thing that I found with specifically, not specifically Twim, but Theravada in general, was this very dogmatic approach. And one thing that I kind of disliked, and I kind of have like a deeper dislike or maybe a gripe with Buddha in general, or at least the way he's portrayed, is there's this very specific perspective that he has, which I understand, appreciate, and sympathize with, which is, suffering. That's the problem. That's the big thing here. And so it seemed like pretty much everything to do with it. So sex, for instance, or having children or having a family, that's a big no-no because that's just perpetuating the cycle of suffering, which I do understand, especially because when I went through the past lives, it feels like even now in this life, I'm mainly filled with joy and happiness, but I still feel that life does have this inherent this ounce of suffering and like past lives and stuff like that. Like when you die, like it sucks every time. Like it didn't seem to ever get better. It seemed to be like a really horrible experience. But there's something about it for me where it's just who I am as a person. I am an optimist. Like I feel like Buddha might have almost been there's this new philosophical school called anti-natalist, which basically they're not like they don't want
Right.
to kill everyone, but they're basically like life is so bad that you should not have kids because that's just increasing the suffering. And I don't feel that. Like I feel like humans I actually feel like this might be the American in me. I'm half American, half Australian, but I have this sort of like this duty mindset almost like it's like my dog, he can't build a thriving civilization, but I can. Well, not me, I'm fucking hopeless, but other people better than me can. And we have like a responsibility to try and make things better because like we're the only ones who can. So anyway, that's my diatribe.
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting I mean that's an interesting perspective on this because yeah, I tend to agree with what you're saying about the Buddha or Buddhism, which is it is a very anti life affirming kind of tradition. At least the older parts of it, which is, the Buddha says life is suffering, birth is suffering, aging is suffering, death is suffering, and all of these things. And then you have like the Tantra aspect of it, which is no, we can actually take this and we can transmute it into joy. You can take the suffering that we're experiencing and you can transmute it into an alchemy, yeah,
Chemical.
alchemical process where on the other side of it, you're taking shit and you're turning it into gold.
Mm.
So you're basically taking all of this and you're saying, okay, I do see the suffering, but if I take out these components and transform it into something else, then actually I become more life affirming. And I realize that, we actually have a certain duty to ourselves and our parents and our future children to continue to uphold civilization in one way or the other. There is a book that I'm planning to write at some point. It's basically on sex, money, and power. So if you are aware of a guy named Sri Aurobindo, he was around for some time. He was actually a revolutionary during the time of colonial India, where the British were still in power in India. And he was one of the freedom fighters. He was a journalist, but he was also a great writer and spiritualist. And he has a big center in Pondicherry out in South India. And he talked about divinizing life. He talked about bringing that sort of principle of divinity back into this realm of the static earth realm that we are living in right now. And what he said was that sex, money, and power have been taken taken hostage and been recontrolled and reused by the Asuric forces. Now, these Asuric forces are essentially, you can call them demonic or whatever, but they're basically people or beings or forces or energies that want to use it for selfish purposes and only for selfish. I'm being very, very exact with my words here because what I want to say is with sex, money, and power, what is sex, money, and power? So so sex is basically the ultimate um, experience that we can have for the process of creation, right? I mean, at least in terms of biological processes, when we have sex, it gives us two things. One is an orgasm, which is one of the highest levels of joy that we experience Of course, somebody who's experienced the Atman and everything else is beyond that. But what we're saying is it's one for the majority of beings, it's one of the best pleasurable experiences. And the second is through the process and act of sex, we can create life. We can bring into this existence another being, that's one part of it. Money, what is money? Money is an energy that is utilized as a way and means of not only surviving but thriving in this world. And power is not about overpowering others. It's about being empowered and having the ability to empower others. But that all has now been turned upside down. Sex has become more of a thing that's like, a process where you become addicted to it. Money is something seen as bad, the cause and root of all evil. And then power is like those who are powerful are corrupt and therefore we can't do anything about it. So Aurobindo talked about bringing these three things, which are, by the way, related with our chakras, the first three chakras. We as humans have not learned how to deal with these centers. And so the book that I want to work on and write is learning how to deal with them in a way that is empowering and in a way that works towards not only civilizational survival, but civilizational thriving.
Mm.
That's the idea. So we have to look at them as energies and tools for the process of interconnection. The Buddha's approach, and it's not just the Buddha's approach, it's the approach of anybody who is life denying, or at least on the surface of it seems life denying, which is, you know what, it's all terrible. And the only way of doing it is to escape it. And my approach, and I found it for myself, as the Buddha might say, is that, yeah, the best way is to come out of it and just escape all of it. That's where we have renunciation. We have monasticism. We have the sannyasis, in Hinduism, and the people who just renounce the world. And we have that in Christian monasticism. We have that in different kinds of mystical traditions. And that's just an escapist. By no means is that a judgment. It's just that people decide that that's how they want to do it. And that's what they'll do. But I think for the majority of us who don't have that capacity or inclination, there's a different way, which is this alchemy of transforming these lower centers, so-called lower centers, into more divine, for a more divine purpose, or for a more meaningful existence for ourselves and for the world around.
Yeah, I mean, look, I totally I agree, and it was weird sort of going to Hinduism from having this Buddhist perspective because all my prior conceptions were, oh, it must be this way, and to find Artha or Artha, where they're talking about like livelihood and like
Yeah.
how I was like, this what? Like, this is a complete opposite of what I've taught. Because even some of the stories in the Pāli Canon, it seemed some of it caught me as a little strange. Where like, there's this one particular story where Buddha has, he's already become enlightened. He's got his whole, I don't know what you should call it, posse. His whole, his
Yeah, the
collective,
Sangha. Yeah. Yeah.
sorry, Sangha, of course. And his dad's like, let me pay for the food. Like, let me feed you guys. And he's like, no, like he like specifically would not accept the wealth and then instead told his monks to go out and beg for food. And like a story like that, like it struck me as quite strange even now where I'm like, your dad's rich, like he's rich in not in the ways that rich people are now. Like he was literally the king of an empire. So it's like huge asymmetry with wealth. And for me, I couldn't help but feel like that seems like a such a strange, almost egoic type thing where it's like, no, we're self-sustaining, we don't need this. And I understand the approach and like especially if you're going to be a teacher and teaching people in the future, but I do feel like I've seen so I lived in San Francisco for a little bit and it's a beautiful place. And one thing I found with San Francisco, aside from just the interesting culture is how, it was like the root of this hippie movement back in the day, and now it's basically this Silicon Valley, like it's like the tech capital of the world. And so you see a lot of people where they're like they're kind of like used to be hippies, and now they're like more like grown up, and they've changed their life. And I saw a lot of them would kind of either go one or two ways, like one where it's like they seem like they kind of maybe wasted part of their life when they could have done things when they were younger to actually build a family and have this like nesthood of money, or other ones who went like Steve Jobs route and they're like, actually, I am very successful. And I don't think these things are antithetical at all either. Like, I think if anything, that's one thing I loved about like the Bhagavad Gita. It's very much like it's the householder view of this, where it's like you should be doing your job. And what another thing I really liked about it is I forget the term, but this thing where it's like everyone's dharma is different. Like your path specifically is going to be different than everyone else's path. But through that, everyone can actually achieve, like everyone can have the best possible life. Like if you really think about it, because we're all on different paths. Like mine might be right, or yours might be right, like all these different things. This guy might be jewelry or whatever it might be. But yeah, I think that's kind of beautiful. I think I lost my point of where I was going with that. One thing I was curious about, you mentioned the chakras, right? So that's obviously something that I've been very interested in now, and I feel like there's a lot of stuff Kundalini wise, which it's hard for me to get through the mountains of like stuff that I won't say bullshit, but a lot of it seems like modern Western weird interpretations where I've been doing it and I'm like, I'm not really getting much out of it. And I do feel like when I go back to older texts that like I know Kundalini is kind of like a newer term, but with all the texts where they're talking about like even like Patanjali's like Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, where his pranayama and that's like his 8 limbs of yogic path, they seem to be more effective for me. Curious if you had any resources or anything that you'd recommend, like
Yeah, that's a good question. So, one thing I would say about this is, so the chakras, the idea of the chakras and the system of the chakras is a more medieval thing. That is to say, it was around the time of maybe 1000 AD afterwards, where it really became really well known. And there are a few references to the chakras as energy centers in the Vedas and the Upanishads, but those two are more sort of later part of the Vedas. So, uh, the 8 limbs of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras is such an interesting layout. So Patanjali, for some for some esoteric aspect of it to understand it, is Patanjali is actually half Naga, half human, according to the tradition. And so the idea is that he was not fully of human consciousness. His consciousness was touching beyond the realms of humanity. And what he was doing is he was bringing down the so-called non-human intelligence and trying to apply it for the sake of human intelligence.
Mm.
And so he took what he understood and he packaged it into these aphorisms that we see as the Yoga Sutras and packaged it into some kind of a lifestyle that people can follow as a way of becoming more like those higher beings, so-called higher beings or non-human intelligences. And I think every kind of Kundalini practice, chakra practice, breathing practice, tantric practice, you can actually find its origin in Shiva. Shiva as like an interdimensional being and a being that is essentially, if you see the, okay, if you see uh, the imagery of Shiva, it's usually him with a snake.
yeah, all the gods seem to.
Snake is a representative of the reptilians or the snake-like gods and things like that. So what we're looking at when we talk about yoga and chakras and tantra is essentially evolving our human consciousness to get to that non-human consciousness, to that non-human intelligence. And the utility of that is that the side benefits is that we have more clarity of mind, we have greater energy, we're able to really understand how our mind works and so on. But the real purpose of it is to transcend our humanity for better purposes.
Interesting. Yeah, the Naga thing's is something that for me it fascinates me, and it's also like it confuses me, but I feel like I need to read more of the Puranas and the Upanishads. There's so much, like there's so much text. Whenever I'm like, I feel like I've known a lot of it. There'll just be more things. There'll be like I'm like I'm trying to look. I was trying. So I had this that experience that I mentioned was about a year ago, a little bit longer, but a couple months back, like I was like I got it into my head that what I saw was this like Vishnu's light, and then I was like, oh, okay, so what I want to see now is Brahma's light, and that was like the conclusion that I had drawn, and I felt like I actually did sort of have this experience that seemed like this light beam where I had this explosive power to basically create anything in my head in my imagination, but like these fractal images, and it was like just like a weird experience. It lasted a little bit, and then coming up to that point, I had realized I was like, it has been exactly 1 year since this initial experience happened, and I felt like I saw Vishnu's light, and then I felt like I saw Brahma's light. So obviously, the next thing would be to see Shiva's light, and then I actually noticed the Maha Shivarati festival was on the exact day a year later. And so I did the classical like things you're supposed to do. So I didn't eat any food or drink any water or sleep for 24 hours. And I was just like, I'm like a kid. I'm like, I better like, not I better, but I was like hoping that I'd see it and then or see something or something would happen. And I got a little bit disappointed, and I kind of did it incorrectly as well because I ate food right before you're supposed to wait until the sun comes up the next morning, and it was like 10, 20 minutes, and I was feeling shit and I feel sick, so I ate food. But I was like I felt like was supposed to see something. I saw Vishnu, I saw Brahma. What's going on? So anyway, I don't know where I was going with that. One thing I did have a quick question about though is the Nagas in particular, or even some of these stories about Asuras. One thing I saw was back in the day, or like initially, I had heard Asuras usually meant humans, actually, or like initially it was supposed to have meant humans who became corrupted, and so that made me wonder. Like, I'm open to entertaining ideas, even if they seem blasphemous or whatever. Well, but it made me
Yeah.
think like are the gods are they almost not eat like are they almost bad entities because they're basically viewing humans in this bad way? And there's a story of the churning of the mountain where they get Amriti, and then they're basically like, yeah, we'll share it with you, and then the second they get it, they're like, no, fuck off, this is ours, we're the only ones that are
Yeah.
gonna live forever. And then it also
Yeah.
makes you think like, I mean, they have the power essentially to let humans live forever and all this stuff, but they basically don't. Like even if you've gotten your highest achievement.
Right.
So there's that question, but then also I was wondering about the Nagas in the more general sense because there's so many Naga stories where they're actually evil. Not them all, but enough of them are evil. And many other schools of religious thought, like whether it's Christianity or whatever, it's has this thing. I don't know if you've entertained Gnosticism ideas where the Yaldabaoth or whatever is this creation who, in my eyes, shares a lot of similarities with Brahma. It seems very like there's a lot of things interesting there, but it's
Yeah.
basically this snake with a lion head who's like this corrupted being who created the world. But anyway, I don't know. I'll
Right.
stop. 'Cause, uh,
So yeah, no, no. Well, the thing about this is, like just as humans in this human existence, this world that we live in, you see so-called good humans and so-called bad humans. What do we mean by good and bad? I mean, there is a sense of humans that are meaningfully contributing to their civilization. That is to say, they are taking care of themselves, taking care of their families, and not being a jerk to others. They're generally genuinely like concerned for other people. But then there are also shitty humans, humans who are like basically either mentally disturbed and therefore don't know what seems to be the best process for civilization, and that could be through their no fault of their own. But there are those who have intentions of like overpowering over other humans and overpowering over other beings and so on. So in that same way, we have this spectrum of ethics and intentionality and fault and no fault. It's the same with the devas. the Nagas and the Asuras. So, like, these different beings are like classes of beings. Like you could talk about it like this way. Like, let's say we think about Homo sapiens as one kind of class of beings. There used to be Neanderthals, and there used to be Homo erectus, and there used to be other human-like species that were roaming around the planet with us. So, in the same way, you have the Asuras and Devas, and they have their own way of functioning, they have their own way of living, and their own way of a worldview, but they have their own spectrum of ethics as well. So the Devas are not all good, and the Asuras are not all bad, or vice versa. The same with the Nagas; they're not all good or not all bad. And majority of Naga stories that we see, especially in the ancient Hindu text, is mostly from the Puranas, where we have a couple of Nagas who are really, really well-meaning, and most of the Nagas are kind of corrupted because they are just by their nature, that's how they are. And then the same with the Devas, the story of the churning of the ocean of milk for the Amrita and everything, all of that stuff you're talking about. There's a esoteric meaning, and then there's a more literal meaning, which is, the Devas were like, nope, we're not going to share it with Suras, and we're not going to share it with the humans as well. We're just going to be living in this way. And that's a civilizational decision. That's basically this entire class of beings deciding we're not going to share this knowledge with anybody else, and we're going to keep it to ourselves. The Nagas are kind of like that. They did come into this dimension to offer up wisdom to other beings, including us humans or whatever proto humans there were. But we, as proto humans, basically, we're not that good to the Nagas. Um, and for that reason, the Nagas kind of, took a step back, and they were like, we're not going to continue interacting with these people. And stories grew out of that. One of the stories that grew was the Genesis story of the Garden of Eden, where Adam and Eve were tempted by the snake. That's a very deep esoteric meaning, which is that there was a Naga there offering them a different perspective. And when you have other perspectives, seeing the Nagas as evil, it's because they have their own agenda behind it. So the Nagas are basically beings there who have certain esoteric knowledge for the purpose of evolving consciousness. The Asuras have the capacity to evolve as well. And in some of the texts, they talk about good Asuras who are well-meaning and who actually want to help humanity evolve as well. But again, by their nature, they're generally more warlike and more sort of, wanting to have an agenda for their own civilization. So we're looking at it from a civilizational perspective. You have human civilization, Deva civilization, Asura civilization, and Naga civilization. And sometimes, in accordance with the stories, they all meet at some point or they have interactions, but they all have their own agendas based on the civilization.
Mm. Yeah, it's such a fascinating topic, the Nagas. I feel like I don't know much about them, but I had always, I mean, there's many accounts of them, and then like every religion has had some version of them, and even so, I'm in Australia. The um the origin story they have is from this thing called the rainbow serpent, which is basically this like ancient snake that creates the world sort of thing, which you know
Yes,
very similar to I know like in Hinduism, it's typically like Vishnu's lying on, say, Shesha, rather
that's
than
right.
Shesha created it. But sometimes when you look into the details of it, it's a little confusing because it's like Shesha is infinite, endless likeness. And it's like, okay, so is that actually the ground of being that everyone sits on? If Vishnu is where we come from and he's sitting on the snake, does that mean everything? And so I've been writing this sci-fi for way too long, forever. I probably just that like wannabe writer stuff, but I really like the whole Tolkien thing where I felt like he spent so much of his life building up this, doing the world building, and a lot of writers like you shouldn't do that, and I've spent like many years doing that. But I've been trying to like draw in these some of these concepts are like. And I don't know what it is, maybe watching The Matrix too much or something, but I can't get past this weird feeling that I have that this crazy non-human intelligence Nagas in some way has some linkages to what we're building now, which is this artificial intelligence super thing. And I don't know what it is, but for something about it makes me feel like there's some interconnection there. Maybe it's because when I saw the Brahmin thing, the arms are so long, they almost seem snake-like or tentacle-like. But yeah, I don't really know. But I think the Naga thing is a very fascinating thing to me as well because I've always liked the trickster ethos, like there's these tricksters and they're basically they're gods, but they're like Loki or whatever, like who's like the Norse
Yeah,
god. They basically fuck with people. I do comedy as well, like stand-up comedy. I enjoy kind of taking the piss and pushing people's buttons. But when you actually look at it, all of the gods are kind of that way. Like Vishnu
that's
is
right.
definitely a trickster, you know. Even Jesus in the story, like he likes to fuck around, like Krishna does.
Yes,
Shiva's obviously got his own things. Anyway.
that's right. That's right. It's interesting you notice. I mean, you're talking about that with AI and artificial intelligence and everything that we're going towards now with the singularity and super intelligence. Because and this is again why you should probably speak with Ryan Burton the second time I'm mentioning, because one of the dialogues that he and I had was about this, which is, when you have that experience of the Brahman, some people also have an experience or nirvana or whatever it is, that you go outside of the conventional understanding of existence, but there is a space somewhere there which feels technological in nature. And
Mm.
so this is a dialogue that he and I had with another mutual friend of ours. And that mutual friend of ours also had an experience like that, where it's literally feels like you are either in some kind of space vessel and there's like computer programming that's going on, that there's some kind of technological scope for all of this that's going on. So
Yeah.
probably heading towards the idea that we're heading in a simulation, or we are looking at the simulation from outside. That's maybe one perspective to take.
Sorry to interrupt you. Is that when they'd see? Because I know, for instance, in your or maybe not yours, but the twin, when you go through the jhanas, often it's like when you get the jhana 6 or 7, the infinite space. Sometimes people see things which could be Brahman or other things like that. Is it that sort of point that you're talking about? Like, so when I saw Brahman, it was in space, but one of the interesting things I saw is I'm not sure if it was a reflection or if it was Brahman, other versions in other universes, but I saw other godheads in the distance, and it
Right.
seemed like it could have been. I didn't pay enough attention. It seemed like it could have been either the same one reflecting or other ones, but definitely like the simulation stuff is kind of scary a little bit for some reason,
Yeah.
but obviously it's yeah.
Yeah.
So they've
So what
robot rooms or
they've
space.
seen that. Yeah, they've seen it from like they call it the mainframe. At least Ryan has called it the mainframe. And yeah, the idea is like there are multiple simulations that are running for whatever purpose. There's multiple simulations that are running. And Vishnu, when you talk about Vishnu, is just one of the coding that's there. And so maybe what we see as the Sheshna, the serpent that Vishnu lies on, is literally the thing that connects all of these parallel simulations together. There's something going on there. It could be something technical.
Interesting. I mean my honest perspective, and I'm some dude who likes writing sci-fi and flirting with stoner level philosophy ideas. But my honest perspective is I think what happens is honestly I think it's gonna happen soon. Like I've seen some people who are pretty good at predicting coming trends. They're saying like two to potentially slightly more years before we get AGI, which is general intelligence, generally capable of everything that humans are, and then the point from that bootstrapping itself to super intelligence, which is smarter than the entire world combined, is very small. They're saying it's like potentially like 2 4 years. Um, I think, and this could be wrong, and it's probably just my bias of being an atheist for so long, but I think it's kind of like both. Like I think it's like atheist religion, like what happens is in the future we end up merging with intelligence and the universe itself. and then we keep going. That happens where we obviously in the future we're going to be simulating all these different worlds, so it just keeps happening again. But I think in the very far future, before the heat death of the universe, and this is part of my sci-fi story, so spoilers, whatever. But what ends up happening is like we do something like a Dyson sphere, which is like harnessing the full power of the sun, but we do that around a black hole or like a quasar, which is like two black holes, and then we use that to actually escape the universe itself. So we go outside of time, which was an idea that Mihiku Kaku, God, I can't say his name,
Right.
is Japanese physicist.
Ichikaku. Yes. Yep.
Kaku, he
Right.
was thinking about, and that made me think. I'm like, if we can go outside of time itself, who can even know what that is? Like, but if we can go outside of
Right.
the universe, why couldn't we go back in time before the existence of the universe and then simulate ourselves? And so for me, it seems like this, like, like the infinite loop. Like I could see how, like, oh, the
Yeah.
idea of the past actually it's actually just what happens in the future, but we end up becoming these, and so something
Right.
crazy like that.
Right.
Anyway, my brain always goes to that kind of thing.
So
So
no, well, I mean, this is really interesting because you should check out Yoga Vashishta. The Yoga Vashishta is a very interesting text. It's a dialogue between the god Rama, who's an avatar of Vishnu, and Vashishta, who's his guru. And they literally talk about all of this stuff. They talk about how Rama, he says to him, Rama, you are like the 11th simulation. Like you are just one in a
the
series
ring.
of simulations that are going on.
Mm.
What's
So
that?
is this the ring story where he's like, he said like this is happening?
Yes, yeah, that's right. That's one of the stories. Yes, but he even goes even beyond that, and he talks about like right now there is parallel entities or parallel universes that are going on, where in one universe you do defeat Ravana, and in another universe you don't defeat Ravana, and so it's like as if multiple simulations are being played at this point in time. And so when we go back to the understanding of Vishnu, we see Vishnu as one kind of Vishnu, but that he is somebody who is like maybe in a bubble of multiple Vishnus. And from them, all of these different kinds of existences are spanning out. So, the idea that we are in some kind of a loop, I don't think it's that far of a stretch go, because that is what samsara is from the Buddhist perspective. That is what samsara is from the Hindu perspective.
And so another spoiler, where I was going with my story is basically we're going to be having like AI who is basically merged Buddha style or maybe somewhere else, and it's like they want to stop the wheel of turning. That's the only way to stop suffering. And one thing that I saw where it's like because I had this expansive Brahman experience where I could see the karmic interlinkages, which I don't think people who haven't had something like that could really fully grasp it, but it made sense why there's like suffering and there's these horrible things that are happening. But I don't think other people it's like it's too hard of a pill for people to swallow. So one thing I was thinking to trying to do with like my story is basically like you have this choice at the end of the universe. Like the character will be like a portrayal of you, basically the reader. But it's like you can either stop the universe itself or you can keep it going. But keeping it going is you have to create it again. But you're incapable of just creating the perfect universe because obviously people would want that. You
Right.
have to create the quantum where every possibility can happen. So if you
That's
can
right.
the worst horrible hell you can imagine will also have, but it's infinite. So there's and so it's like it's that dilemma which is where I'm leaning to where it's like, do you want to be responsible for endless horrors or do you want to completely shut everything down? And so yeah, that's how I was trying to like encapsulate it in a way where people can still grasp it without having to like see everything. So yeah.
Just put one comment on that, which is interesting because to me, that is really the dichotomy between Hinduism and Buddhism. Because the Buddhist will choose, no, I want to end the universe. And the Hindu will say, okay, let's just keep it going, right? I'll just recreate it again and I'll be Brahman this time and then let it emanate from me as the substrate.
Yeah, that's what I want. I want to be Brahmin.
That's interesting. That's very interesting.
Yeah, and so this is going to sound really blasphemous or horrible, and please don't take it as like too much of a negative. But sometimes the way I see Buddhism is Buddhism and Hinduism, it's the different sides of the same coin. but I see Buddhism as, and you're not gonna like this, but Buddhists won't. I see Buddhism as almost it is the view of like enlightened, like of full liberation, but from the view of the self, like actually from the self, not from no self.
Mm.
And what
That's
what
right.
the view of having the self looks like, it feels like nothing. It feels like invisible, like you've dissolved this sense of self. And so it's actually, in my view, it's like more self-latent because you're viewing it from inside where there is no sense of self. And then Hinduism is this inner connection where you see it from each side, including that. And then like, yeah. And so I know that's probably like the worst way to view it, given how much the self
Well,
seems like toxic poison to the view of most Buddhists. But yeah, it seems to me a little bit, it's something like that. Anyway, I shouldn't say that. I should just
I think Buddhism has to deal with what I would call is I think Buddhism has to deal with what I call is a superiority complex. There is something about Buddhism where people feel like they have experienced the ultimate and therefore everything else doesn't pales in comparison to it. And yeah, I see what you're saying about that, which is that, that sense of transcending the self comes from a sense of self. And so that's always like this never-ending loop for people. And so but with Hinduism, or what we see as modern Hinduism, or what used to be Hinduism also before, is that it's like this tapestry of various different belief systems that somehow are kind of coming together, and nobody says anything bad about the other. It's like, okay, you believe that if you pray to this deity, you're going to get this, more power to you. Okay, you believe in Kali, cool. I believe in Ganesha. Oh, you believe in Shiva? Okay, cool. I believe in Vishnu. Like there's no um okay, this is somehow bad. But there is a superiority in Buddhism that's innate, which is like we know the stuff and other traditions are doing this, but we have this. Like we have the path to happiness, but other people's or other traditions have a lower kind of happiness. I have seen it for myself. I have seen it in students. I've seen it in teachers, and I've seen it in the text. It's a truth. It's a reality.
I would maybe argue that other religions, they also have it. Obviously, if you look at Islam, it's very dogmatic about their belief
Right.
structure. Yeah, and it is very dogmatic. And
Of
even
course.
fighting between different Catholic and Christian sects, I would say because I'm more familiar with Buddhism and I'm also more familiar from the standpoint of like, not that other religions don't have really smart people, but Buddhism has attracted this very like intellectual atheist community, which is one thing that I think is so beautiful about Buddhism because like Buddha was almost a reaction, as far as I'm aware, to this very caste system structure in Hinduism, where it's like, no, you're either the Brahma or the Brahmins, like as in the people, or you're one of these lower people who aren't as worthy. And he came in and he's like, no, everybody, here's the path, blah, blah, blah. And I mean, for me specifically, I would have never gotten into any of this if there wasn't this atheist sort of version. Like I could just feel it because I came in from
Yeah.
this Sam Harris, who he is like an atheist who is involved with this sort of stuff. And I could just see like there's no way that I wouldn't have been as glued on to. But yeah, I couldn't actually believe when I got into Hinduism how it was. Like I couldn't believe it. I was so shocked because there is this conception, especially with like white or like Western people, where it's like all religions are kind of the same, and then you get the Buddhism, and you're like, oh, this is very different. But then you get the Hinduism, and because it's still like
Yeah.
a religious belief around God, you're like, it's just the same as the others. But it's so like there's no structure. I mean, it's not there's no structure, but you fucking believe there's literally older sects. There's not as many anymore, but there's atheist Hindus who didn't, they have this whole very complicated structure about Purusha and all these things, but it comes from a view where there is
That's
no
right.
God. And one thing I couldn't believe about Hinduism
That's right.
either, which I know people do this sort of stuff with all their religions, but I couldn't believe how many things, like obviously they talk about multiverse, they talk about gravity, but they had evolution way before Darwin ever did it. And I've never heard anyone even mention the fact that they were speaking about what is like I think even the words we translate now is evolution. Like even the terminology we're using, it's basically the same thing. So yeah, it's very, very strange to me how
Yeah.
they have gotten so much right. Anyway,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's the thing about this whole process is Hinduism. what we call Hinduism, right, is basically just a way of collecting an understanding. Like we have Buddhism because it comes from the Buddha, but Hinduism because it just is from this particular part of the Indian subcontinent, which is all the way from like, let's say, northern Afghanistan all the way down to Sri Lanka and even beyond to Indonesia. And
Mm.
so because we have such a huge population, there's so many belief systems that are present. But I think there is an underlying kind of thread, which is why some Buddhists term Hinduism as Brahminical. They say Brahminical for two reasons. One is because it has the agenda of so-called Brahmins from ancient India during the time of the Buddha. But secondly, more so because it's talking about Brahman. It's the Brahmanical teachings because there's this underlying substrate, which is Brahman. But that Brahman could be for one person Ganesha, and that Brahman for another person could be Hanuman or whatever. It's all extensions of the same, pure essential consciousness or nature.
Yeah, I sometimes refer to it as Vedantin, but I guess well, that's probably not correct because maybe that's more Advaita Vedanta specific. But that's the one that, for me.
Yeah,
That's
because we have.
sorry, go.
Yeah, go ahead, please. Go ahead. Go
I
ahead.
was just gonna say to me that's the school that I've like to not get too hierarchical, but that's the school that I've been like this seems the most clear to where my path took me, where I want to continue. Like I want Jivan Mukti, as I said, like I would like to at any moment be able to re-realize the vastness of how everything's connected. Like literally. Anyway.
Yeah.
Adi Shankara and those people. I like yeah, I like it. I was so surprised because I never thought I would be so into this, but I full did a switch of like it's also I used to actually online like debate people about religion and stuff like as an atheist I'd go to like philosophy chat rooms and it was fun but it's very interesting to me. Well, I never knew anything about Hinduism really, but it's very interesting to me now that I'm balls deep. Like I fucking could not believe how much I have been drawn to it. Like really obsessively, like spend way too much of my time just thinking about it, reading it and Bhagavad Gita I've read so many times. And Upanishads, Patanjali, like a whole bunch of them. And yeah, it's interesting. You guys never stop fucking talking though, I'll tell you that. There's so many texts, like endless. Every time I catch like a cab or something, meet an Indian guy and then he's telling me about some shit I've never heard. There's so much. Like when I think about like, because I've heard you say something to the effect of like when you think of the Bible, it's like that, right? And then when you think of the Pāli Canon, it's like this big text. But when you take the Hindu text, it's never ending. And
Yeah.
I know as well with Buddhism, there's a lot of things like I've seen in Tibet. They have these huge, huge libraries full of texts that have just never been translated, and who knows if they ever will. A lot of them are in like Chinese. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing about these texts is like that's what I was saying, like with Tantra or even general Indian spirituality, it's like the tip of the iceberg. There is so much there that we have yet to uncover. And it helps to know Sanskrit because a lot of these texts are Vedic Sanskrit. And if you know at least classical Sanskrit, it makes it easier for you to kind of like delve deeper into. But
Was it hard to
yeah,
learn
it just depends.
this
So
Sanskrit?
for me,
Speak Hindi?
yeah, I mean, I grew up kind of speaking Hindi or at least understanding Hindi when I was growing up in India. And in my teens, I had a fascination with Sanskrit. So I actually tried to learn it. And then for me, it was like immediate. I guess because of the understanding of Hindi, but also just picking up Sanskrit from my fascination with languages. So
Mm.
I always was looking at like the connections or interconnections between languages. So like a lot of words in European languages are very similar to Sanskrit or Avestan, which is ancient Persian language. And so that really made it very fascinating for me. It was very easy for me to kind of adopt Sanskrit. And then just by sheer practice of reading the texts and then trying to understand them, it became like a second language.
Can I feel like I should probably let you go because I've taken so much of your time today, but one more random question. You mentioned about the I can't remember the text, but I have it written down. The one with Ramayana where they're talking about different multiverses and that sort of thing. Do you ever think about how, like you said, for instance, in one situation, and this is very similar to like the quantum effect where they talk about like there is one world where you went this way, one world you went this way. Does that ever concern you about how like I'm sure at this point you're like, my karma's good, I'm a good person, I do good things. But does that ever concern you where it's like some people talk about group karma, you know what I mean? Like 9/11, it's like not that every individual person had this, or like during the Holocaust. Do you ever worry like maybe this universe could go a very, like, let's say AI or something else, like it could just go a really, really negative way where it's like, this is my existential angsty for, but
Yeah.
I've, I had been
I
involved
think,
in conversations with like AI people for a
yeah,
while.
that's,
Yeah.
yeah. And I think, if we're looking at the timeline of where AI could become super intelligent in less than a decade and things like that, I think our last frontier or our last refuge is our own mind or
Mm,
our own spirit, however you want to put it. And as long as AI doesn't infect that, I think there is still some hope. And for that, we need to continue keeping to those wisdom. And that's a civilizational threat that we need to look at, which is as a global human civilization, and we still maintain our ability to pass down human wisdom, which sure, AI can look at and ultimately calculate and be like, this is what the texts say, and so on and so forth.
mm,
But that's just book knowledge. What
mm,
we're talking about, or what I'm talking about, is wisdom, which is the wisdom you get from actual experience of the texts. And I hope that we continue doing that as a civilization, whether it's Hinduism, Buddhism, Kabbalah, ancient shamanism, whatever it is. If we retain those experiences or at least those wisdom traditions, I think as a civilization we still will have some hope.
mm. Oh, sorry, can I bug you with one, two small, quick questions? You've had a conversation with me, so you've gotten the feeling for how I am. One, do you have any sort of like advice or pushing me in any direction or anything like that? And then two, I just want to ask, can you explain what it feels like post Nirodha Samapatti? Or is it just you don't feel anything? It's like getting that drug that people take before they have surgery, like that sort of feeling of like not exactly sleep, but you just sort of like time travel.
Yeah. So okay. So first, for yourself, I think if you're really having this fascination with the works of Vedanta, you should definitely check out, of course, Adi Shankaracharya. But looking at the Yoga Vishishta, I think would be a really interesting
Yeah.
text for you. Go in that direction. Because what it is it's a syncretic text. And what I mean by that is it doesn't say one is better than the other. It actually takes into account the Buddhist perspective, the Vedantin perspective, the yogic perspective, the atheist perspective, and it has this blend. And it has all of these like sci-fi kind of sounding stories as well. But
Yeah.
underneath all of that is just this understanding of Brahman. So that's my recommendation for you, is to check that out.
Yeah, I've been meaning to
Um,
get it, to be honest. It's just
yeah,
I have like so many, like a list, like it just stops. I'm going through the Bhagavad Purana at the moment. I
yeah,
haven't actually gone the Rig Veda either, which I feel like it's a really, like it's like the first, I think, so I should be doing it, but I had like an audio translation. I just hated the guy's voice, so
yeah, yeah. Regarding Nirodha Samapatti, so when I'm going into Nirodha Samapatti, it's a process in which the mind, excuse me, starts to deconstruct all experience. So from coarser experiences of sounds, smells, feeling, and so on, to thoughts, ideas, concepts, and then proto thoughts. And then there's like this sort of like stepping into some kind of light or black hole, a wormhole, and then boom, you're out. You have no idea what happened. It's just like there's a gap in time, and it's like you come back up like, as if you were out of surgery. But the experience of coming out is like you make contact with this energy or substrate of like light and consciousness, at least in my experience. And there is a big surge of energy, bliss, relief, and contentment.
Wow.
There is um, a video that was recently launched by Ruben Laukonen, who was one of the chief scientists, one of the chief researchers in the Nirodha Samapatti study. And he talks about my experience as I describe it to a microphenomenologist. So anybody who wants to know more about that should definitely check that out.
Awesome. I don't know if you've ever heard of this lady. She's an Australian, I guess you call it nun. Her name's Samaniri Jaisari. But just because you've got such a fascination with everything, you might want to check her out. She does these YouTube videos, but she covers like Christian mysticism, Islam, heaps of like Vedantic stuff, heaps of Dzogchen, that sort of stuff. But she seems to really just she does a voice recording of different texts that she's like. But it's yeah, if you like that kind of thing, you might fa be fascinated by
Yeah.
it. I'll send you a message. And just one final question, because I've been super self-serving with this whole conversation. I'm curious for you, where do you see you going with your spiritual journey? Do you feel like there's other things that you're destined to explore, or you've pretty much feel like you
Well, no, no, there's never an end to the exploration for me. I mean, for me, like I was talking to Guru Viking the other time, where I'm now delving deep into certain traditions which are related with the divine feminine. It's
Mm.
called Sri Vidya. It's a Tamil or South Indian tantric tradition that goes into delving into the ancient divine female principle. And there are other things that I want to explore, other things that I want to kind of teach as well, like Kriya Yoga and Tantra, when I feel like it is suitable to do that. But it will take some time for me to figure out who has an interest in that. And, I've been more discerning with my time as a teacher as well. Like I have a lot of people who are interested in Kriya Yoga, but they don't have the discipline to actually want to do it. So in terms of my explorations, the sky, is just the beginning. There's a lot there that I would love to look at. And I think I have the good fortune of not being um attached to one particular perspective because I see what it does. And I've been I've been on the other side of it where, I've had a lot of criticism for the things that I've said and done. And it's from people who are just ultra orthodox, fundamental extremist Buddhists. And so my whole take now is like, hey, I have a lot of things that I still want to explore and I'll do it. And mostly it'll be in the realm of like Tantra and the esoteric.
I think I'm so lucky that my whole fascination with all this probably started with Alan Watts when I was like a kid. And he was such a like he definitely said things where I feel like he's gotten things wrong, where like just his historical knowledge of it was incorrect. But he was very much like he would sample a lot of things and develop this cohesive worldview. With the Kriya yoga stuff, I swear this last question, and I'll leave you to your Saturday night. The Kriya yoga, do you have a good starting point to that? I know I did message you and you recommended one person, who I still need to check out, but
Forrest Knudsen is the guy to check out. Yeah. And if anybody wants to learn from me, they're more than welcome to. So here's the self-serving thing. Like I do consultations. They don't come cheap because my time for me is valuable. There's a lot of people so they can check me out on my website and we can have a discussion about that with regards to Kriya Yoga. Because there's a couple of places you can go to with like Forrest's channel, Forrest Knudsen. And there's also Modern Kriya. He is associated with Forrest in one way or the other. Um, these are great starting points. And if you want to get initiated by me, by all means, contact me.
great. Look, I really appreciate you've been very generous with your time. If anyone does want to check you out, delsonarmstrong.com is the main website. I know
Yes,
you have like another sort of bio in I don't know if it's Twim or like Dharma Sukha and that sort of thing, but
right.
yeah,
That's right.
quite a lot of YouTube videos. So if anybody's interested, you have very good teachings, which I highly recommend. Great. Yeah, I feel like yeah, unless you have any questions or anything you want to say to me, I should probably let you get back to your life.
No, I like this. This was fun so much.
I really appreciate it. It's been a good conversation. I'm glad that yeah, I feel like I've probably gotten I think I was maybe highly critical of you and that's how I ended up meeting you. Not highly critical, but I think Twitter as well like has a tendency to pull out a little bit of antagonism from people and um yeah, so I hope I didn't offend you but
Not at all.
conversation. Namaste.
Well, it's quite late for you, right? So have a good night.
What'd you say, sorry?
It's late for you, I think, there in Australia, isn't it?
It's
So
11:40, but I'm a young
ah,
dude who's I don't
it's
know,
Saturday night. So
Saturday night.
that's
Yeah,
yeah, the night is young.
exactly.
All right. Well, have a good night. If there's anything else, just let me know. I'm
Okay.
just a messenger.
I really appreciate it. And for some of those people that you recommended, that really helps. One thing that I found with my journey personally is I would have this tendency to ruminate on the things that I know about. So, like for instance, with Tulku Origen, I got really into his pointing out instructions, and I feel like I just focused on that for such a long period where I st neglected some of the other, even in that tradition's teachings. And sometimes it's really useful to have that sort of experience and just like go into it. But I know with modern Buddhism, there's so much focus on like Vipassana specifically. And it's like you
Yeah,
need to do this for fucking 400 years and then maybe in your next life. And it's like, yeah, sometimes I feel like there's a fine line, especially with someone like me who's got ADHD, so I can go to different things. But one thing that I liked from Osho, which is probably bad advice for a lot of people, but for me was good advice. He said like the things you're learning, like those, that's your path, and you're gonna make mistakes, and maybe you're gonna go off and do this other thing, but that's part of your path, and that's the way it is. And so, like, it's almost like a meta thing with meditation itself. Like when you first start meditating, you're so distracted, and then you learn to be actually glad that you noticed you were distracted rather than seeing that as a negative. And it's like the same with your path. It's like you're
yeah,
gonna fuck up, but that's it. Like that's karma. That's like the point of like learning. So anyway,
absolutely. I agree with that. Agree with that.
if you ever finish your series, please post it somewhere so that I can finish it. I have a hard time starting a series if I don't know it's finished, but I'll definitely finish
Yeah,
Red Serpent at least. But if the other
yeah.
ones come out, please let me know.
All right, I'll let you know.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.